Hello, everybody. I'm a practicing therapist and a doctoral student of psychology, and today I wanted to go over why avoidant and anxious individuals are drawn to one another. Why is it so hard for them to break up? What is the reason that they remain together regardless of how unhealthy it can be? Overall, the main reason is that these two individuals meet an insecurity of themselves rather than the perceived need that they have. So I'll break that down, of course. Now, I'm not saying all relationships that are avoidant and anxious are unhealthy, and I'm also saying not all of them fit this category, okay? But because of this, where two individuals meet an insecurity but do not meet the need, they actually end up going into a cycle where there's a lot of highs and lows. This creates a chemical connection, but emotional tension and dysregulation, which ultimately ends typically in a very painful way. If unhealed and unrepaired, this relationship can leave both individuals emotionally scarred by the dynamic and actually intensifies the wounds that they have. And that's actually part of the reason they're drawn to each other. So let's go ahead and break this up so that we can really get into understanding this as well as how to heal this, okay? The first aspect is what I actually brought up right in the beginning of the video, right? And that is basically that they meet each other's insecurities, right? And so what do I mean by that? Let's go ahead and paint it using an example. So an anxious individual, their insecurity is that they are unlovable, that they believe they are not worthy. They feel very insecure about themselves. They lack self-esteem and confidence, and they tend to, especially if they're more, if they have a lot of anxieties just in general, they tend to not have a lot of goals that they're reaching in their life, and they very much are overly fixated on being in a relationship and actually loving somebody, right? So they don't have a lot going on in their life. And I'm not saying that in a bad way. I'm just illustrating part of their insecurity. So they are drawn to somebody who meets that, right? If it's almost like in their mind, if they can draw and connect to somebody who is independent, who has all these things going on in their life, who is not feeling insecure about themselves, they feel like they're worthy of that and their insecurity is met. Right? However, unfortunately, their perceived need is not met. Their need is that they feel loved. However, unfortunately, the avoidant individual cannot meet that need, right? And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But right now, we're just talking about the insecurity. So they feel insecure, and they can get that void taken care of, right? Let's look at another example for the avoidant partner. The avoidant individual feels like they're not emotional. They feel like they're robotic. They feel like they're detached, that they don't understand human connection. Some of them feel insecure that they're not very social. And so these insecurities, they feel very different. They feel very abnormal. And they feel, different from the average individual. And so for that reason, they're very drawn to a partner who seems very emotionally inclined, could be a little bit more kinder and more gentle, more able to understand emotions, understanding the connection of interpersonal relationships and the value of it, right? And so in their mind, they are able to meet their own insecurity. So what do I mean by meeting an insecurity? What does that mean? So another way to paint it is this. Now, I'm not saying that this is necessarily wrong or right. And any words I use, I'm not trying to be harsh. I know I can be a little direct sometimes, but bear with me. Some individuals, let's say they feel unattractive. So this is not an attachment example. An individual, let's say they feel unattractive. They feel like if they get an attractive partner, their perception of attractive, right? And their perception of them being unattractive. But they feel like if they get an attractive partner, they feel like, okay, this is proof that I'm attractive as well. And so that is exactly what I mean by meeting the insecurity. An avoidant individual, okay, maybe I am robotic, but I can't be that robotic if I'm with a partner who's very emotional and very animated, right? An anxious individual, maybe I am insecure, and maybe I don't have a lot of different avenues or hobbies, but my partner does. So I can't be that, afraid of, that lacking of my self-worth. Sorry if that sounds harsh, but I couldn't really think of another sentence. And so they're able to feel they can meet that insecurity. However, what ends up happening is they don't get their need met because the need is different from the insecurity. And we'll talk about how that becomes a cycle. But basically, what happens is because they're attracted by the insecurity they have, and that doesn't mean the love is not necessarily real, but because they're attracted to what they're lacking, they cannot connect because it's what they don't have. And so there's a clash between how they are perceived. So an anxious individual, they're not getting their need met, which is they want love and they want affection, but they picked a partner who is in fact not that way. They're picking a partner who is overly independent, who values autonomy, and anxious individuals don't necessarily value autonomy the same way avoidants do. Anxious individuals like being with their partner all the time. They tend to immerse themselves in their partner's life, whereas avoidant individuals don't like that at all. And so they're not meeting each other's needs. Avoidants like space, independence. Anxious individuals, they like being close together, drawing as close as possible, connecting, committing right away. This is very different. And so that is how the cycle becomes. The insecurity is met, but the need is not met. And so they continue to cycle. So let's talk about another reason why they tend to be drawn to one another. The dynamic reminds them of their childhood. And why this happens from a psychological perspective, and I'm not going to get too into it because that will be a very long video, and I feel that it's a little unnecessary, at least at this point. What basically happens is all individuals, from a biological perspective as well, psychologically, we are more wired to stay with what we are familiar with because in our mind, uncertainty can be perceived as a higher risk. Because something is something we are familiar with and we have psychologically survived this situation, we believe it is more safer than something that we are unfamiliar with that we have not survived yet. That's a psychological reason to it. And so, what does that mean in terms of the dynamic in childhood? A lot of avoidant individuals, for example, they grew up with parents who had high expectations for them, were demanding at times. Some even had parents that were overly suffocating and emotionally taxing on them. So an example could be, I'll give you two examples of how avoidant childhood works. And usually you see both if it's a severe case, and that happens a lot. But let's say we have an avoidant, let's just say an avoidant daughter. And I'll show you how both of them can happen at the same time. It doesn't always happen this way. But let's say she has a father who has very high expectations, right? She's got to be an athlete, and she's got to have the best grades, and she's got to be physically fit. She's got to be strong. And she also has to go fishing with him. And she also has to know how to fix a truck. And she also has to, be attractive. And she also has to make money. And so she's got to have goals for her education, go to a good college, whatever it may be. And at the same time, the dynamic is her mother may be very attached to her, very clingy. Her mom's self-esteem is very attached. So maybe her mom is hoping her daughter's going to go to college so that maybe mom didn't go to college. So she can be proud of somebody. So she's very attached to her daughter. She gets upset if her daughter doesn't answer text messages. She's always wanting her daughter to comfort her, whatever it may be. So as you can see, this dynamic is creating, right? This daughter, as you can probably imagine, is an avoidant individual. She has become that way in childhood and has grown into it. And so the dynamic increases. Dad expects a lot, mom expects a lot, right? And at the same time, dad is very high expectations. Mom is emotionally demanding. And so you can see these dynamics play out when avoidant is with an anxious individual. Anxious individuals tend to have very high expectations without realizing it. Now, it doesn't seem like it's a high expectation, but to an avoidant, it is. An anxious individual, basically, without realizing it, expects an avoidant to basically change entirely. Most of the things that an avoidant is very triggering for an anxious individual. So to an avoidant individual, it feels like you're trying to make a lion into a hippo, Like it's such a high expectation. An anxious individual does not understand that because they're feeling very triggered. But that high expectation is the same, for example, with this woman we were talking about. That's the same way her dad was just like, no, you got to be here. If you're doing this way, then you got to be even better. If you have an A, you got to get an A+. If you got into Johns Hopkins, that's not good enough. I want you to get into Harvard. They're trying to reach some of these goals that are very strict, right? And it doesn't make a lot of sense for the avoidant individual, but they're used to that feeling. On the same time, not all the time is it always this case, but just with this example, she has both types of parents. Mom is always wanting emotional support. She's always expecting the avoidant individual to put her feelings away for her mom. And so we see that all the time. So that's how her childhood is. How her feeling is with her anxious partner is that very same dynamic. So let's go ahead and flip it. Let's go ahead and talk about an anxious individual. What is their dynamic that's being played out in childhood? Well, they had a parent typically who was not there for them all the time. I gave this example in a couple of videos, but it's like you leave a child who you're ignoring them until they cry out, till they crash out, and then the parent goes and nurtures them. So it could be a neglectful parent, it could be a busy parent, but what happens is the child themselves only starts learning how to get their needs met by crying out and getting what they want. So they feel very neglected. The entire relationship of their parent is neglected. However, suddenly there's that small moment where they finally get a little bit of something, a little breadcrumb, right? A little scraping of something. And that's what they're used to. And the avoidant is that kind of feeling. The smallest bit, it feels so good. It feels chemical for them, right? And they feel so comfortable. Sometimes it's even addicting. Some patients have said that, where it feels like they finally get just a little bit of something. And that's the same feeling they had with their dynamic in their family life. Now, that's not always the case, but it's just an example, right? Not every avoidance childhood is exactly like that. Sometimes they may have only one type of parent. They may have a different dynamic completely, but typically the childhood is the best way to distinguish what your attachment style is. Now, that doesn't mean the childhood is exactly as I described, but it's going to be very similar. It's usually how the child feels. When you look at the child, they felt, if you're an anxious individual, you felt very lonely. You felt like your needs were not getting met. If you're an avoidant individual, you felt like you had a lot of expectations on you that you couldn't have an emotional reaction. You will be reprimanded for it, right? And so that's typically how it goes. Fearful avoidant is a little bit different. Fearful avoidants, unfortunately, they tend to have the most trauma. And so you can have these individuals. And by the way, all insecure attachments can have abuse, but it's much more common when you're a fearful avoidant, where you have lots of these types of expectations in conjunction. Typically, you will have a parent with fearful avoidance. You'll have a very high expectation typically as well, but there's a lot of abuse. Now, that doesn't mean anxious individuals can't have that as well, but typically with fearful avoidance, that's usually how it is. And just a little side note, but individuals who are abusers, typically their attachment style tends to be fearful avoidant because they pick up those traits from their parents, because fearful avoidants typically have abuse in their childhood. Just something to bring up, but that'll be another video. Anyways, so the dynamic is played out. So that comfort element of the dynamic of the avoidant and anxious towards each other. The next one is they both can escape actual healing of themselves by remaining in the dynamic. So an avoidant individual, when they're with an anxious person, they don't have to change. They can just say that, oh, it's the anxious person. They're too clingy. That's the problem. Anyone would feel this way if they were with an anxious person. There's truth to that. Secure individuals become more avoidant when they're with an anxious person. However, that doesn't mean that the avoidant doesn't need to change, but it's a great excuse for them. On the flip side, anxious individuals say the same thing. Anybody who is with an avoidant becomes anxious. That's true. I've seen that, but definitely not as extreme, right? And so what ends up happening is the anxious individual can blame the avoidant for the dynamic, and the avoidant individual can blame the anxious for the dynamic. And so neither of them take accountability, and that makes them not have to face the trauma that they've experienced in their childhood, right? And so this is very convenient for them in a very maladaptive way. So the last reason is the cycle creates a temporary bliss. And Now that you hear those 4 reasons, we're going to go ahead and jump into what this cycle is I'm talking about. The cycle that creates temporary bliss. I think this cycle is very important. I see it all the time. Unfortunately, it is not a healthy cycle. It is quite traumatic for both sides, okay? And if you're seeing this dynamic in your relationship, I did give a little bit of points at the end of the video how we can break this cycle, okay? So here's typically how the cycle goes. In the beginning of the relationship, the avoidant and anxious connect and things go pretty well. The anxious tends to fall for the avoidant due to their mystery and charm, while the avoidant feels comfortable by the anxious putting them on a pedestal. So it's kind of that insecurity we talked about, the insecurity they have of themselves. Their partner is able to meet that. The anxious wants more, and the avoidant starts to retreat due to feeling suffocation. Then, during this time, the relationship starts becoming a little bit more negative, right? Becomes a little more unhealthy. And we see the negative narratives begin occurring. The anxious begins to feel unloved, complains about their partner being distant, and criticizing their partner out loud, right? In hope that their partner will change. What ends up happening is the avoidant indirectly or silently becomes very critical, feels very suffocated, and feels very criticized while they perceive their partner as demanding and needy, right? The anxious partner feels they're losing control of the situation because the avoidant is not reacting. The avoidant is becoming critical and annoyed by the anxious individual as the anxious individual continues to press and nag their partner, sorry if these are harsh words, I'm sorry, about the needs that they're not getting met. But their avoidant individual, their partner, is not changing. And so what ends up happening is they demand change or they will leave, right? They try to put their foot down. However, this is not typically what they actually want. It's a protest behavior. They're trying to get their avoidant to have some reaction. What ends up happening is the avoidant individual may temporarily cave. So they temporarily listen, typically to avoid conflict and losing their partner, which leads to temporary bliss for the anxious individual because now the anxious individual feels like their avoidant partner cares. What ends up happening is the avoidant also feels bliss and connection because there's a lack of argument due to the anxious partner not picking on arguments because they're feeling loved. So that's that temporary bliss I mentioned. However, why is it temporary? Because what ends up happening is the avoidant begins to feel smothered again. The anxious individual wants more and more and more. And so the avoidant starts pulling away. The anxious, again, attempts to control and manipulate. The avoidant feels resentment. So the resentment is building up, but they cave again. The cycle continues and continues until at one point, and this is typically how it goes, the avoidant individual, not all the time, but typically the avoidant individual tends to exit these long-term relationships because of the increased conflict and the fact that they feel like they just can't do it anymore. And for an avoidant individual, they have a less likelihood to want the relationship to work because they value relationships less. So typically that's why the avoidant leaves more often in this scenario. The bliss, the repetition of the bliss is why the avoidant and anxious stay together. So this is the main reason why anxious and avoidance are drawn to one another. That cycle, the chemical balance, the chemical, I guess, imbalance, but we don't need to get into that. They feel a chemical that's drawn, helping them to connect and have certain memories. However, that positive connection is very quickly readjusted based on their disconnect and detachment towards the actual relationship. They're actually not getting their needs met. They're just feeling some form of temporary feelings that do not overall make them feel like this relationship is valuable, which is why both individuals tend to come out feeling very, very hurt. And typically both of them become more extreme versions of what they used to be, okay? Now, solutions on how both individuals can adjust so that this doesn't happen. Very, very easily input. And I have so many videos about this, so I'm not going to make a whole entire video of something I've already made. But overall, avoidant individuals, what is important is to work towards tolerating intimacy. And anxious individuals work towards accepting uncertainty. Now, I have a video about how to make you and your partner secure. And you guys can look into that for a more detailed explanation of this particular dynamic. But overall, it just means anxious individual, accept uncertainty, avoidant, start tolerating intimacy. And that's basically the reason. But if you are noticing that you are seeing the cycle happen, don't fret. It doesn't mean the relationship is over, but it does mean that it's at a point where it might be critical and you guys might need something changed, okay? Go ahead, subscribe, like, and I'll see you in the next one.